So in this video, I'm going to do an analysis of The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. The Story of an Hour by American author Kate Chopin is a mainstay of feminist literary study. Originally published in 1894, the story documents the complicated reaction of Louise Mallard upon learning of her husband's death. It is difficult to discuss The Story of an Hour without addressing the ironic ending. If you haven't read the story yet, you might as well, as it's only about 1,000 words. At the beginning of this story, news that will devastate Louise. So at the beginning of the story, Richard and Josephine believe they must break the news of Bentley Mallard's death to Louise Mallard as gently as possible. Josephine informs her in broken sentences, veiled hints that revealed in half-concealing. Their assumption, not an unreasonable one, is that this unthinkable news will be devastating to Louise and will threaten her weakened heart. So basically, in The Story of an Hour, an old woman named Louise, who has a heart condition, finds out that her husband has just been killed. And the servants are thinking, oh my goodness, when we break the news that her husband has just been killed, Louise, poor Louise, she's going to become a widow and she's going to be devastated. So this is the setting of The Story of an Hour, where Louise, the widow, finds out that her husband has just been killed, and now for a whole hour we get to witness Louise's reaction to the news of her husband's death. But instead of being devastated, Louise experiences a growing awareness of freedom. Yet something even more unthinkable lurks in the story. Louise's growing awareness of the freedom she will have without Bentley. At first, she doesn't consciously allow herself to think about this freedom, but the knowledge reaches her wordlessly and symbolically via the open window, which she sees the open square in front of her house. The repetition of the word open emphasizes possibility and lack of restrictions. And so the fact that instead of being sad over her husband's death, Louise feels like she's been let out of prison, that she's finally free. So then the reader can infer that Bentley Mallard is a controlling husband who doesn't allow his wife to do anything. But actually that kind of husband is just like the husband that we see in yellow wallpaper, in which the husband at that time period was supposed to be, you're supposed to control your wife. That was expected. You know, one man will say to the other, your wife is misbehaving, can't you control her? And that was like so common when men talk to men together, husband to husband. So men were expected to control their wives, but as a result, the wives felt restricted. Just like you're going to read in the yellow newspaper, Trifles, and The Story of an Hour. All of them, what they all have in common is a domineering husband and a wife that feels trapped. So here you have Louise. She's aware that her husband has just passed away, and now all she can think about is now she's free of him instead of being sad. And so as a result, as she thinks about her freedom, she's full of energy and hope. The trees are all aquiver with the new spring of life. So then in the story itself, you see words like all aquiver with the new spring of life, as she thinks about the possibilities that opens up to her in a life without her husband domineering. The delicious breath of rain in the air. Sparrows are twittering. Louise can hear someone singing a song in the distance. So she sees the possibilities that arise from such a freedom. She observes these patches of sky without registering what they might mean. And describing Louise's gaze, Chopin writes, it was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. If she had been thinking intelligently, and norms might have been prevented her from such a heretical recognition. Instead, the world offers her veiled hints that she pieces together without. In other words, Little by little, she looks around the world, the sky looks bluer, the flowers look more, poignant, everything looks beautiful, more beautiful, because she sees herself as free of her husband. In fact, Louise resists the impending awareness, regarding it fearfully, as she begins to realize what it is, to beat it back with her will. Yet its force is too powerful to oppose. So in other words, she knows she's supposed to be sad. I mean, everybody expects you to be sad when you receive the news of your husband's death. You're not supposed to be happy when your husband dies. And so at first, Louise feels guilty and tries to resist feeling, the feeling of freedom. Yet she can't help it. She can't help feeling free. She can't help feeling a sense of release, you see. And yet she feels uncomfortable. This story can be uncomfortable to read because on the surface, Louise seems to be glad that her husband has died. But this isn't quite accurate. She thinks of Bentley's kind, gentle hands and the face that has never looked save with love upon her. And she recognizes she has not finished weeping for him. And so when I say controlling husband, not all the controlling husbands were so mean. I mean, they controlled their wives out of love. And so some of the controlling husbands, unlike maybe the one in Trifles, that one might have been a bit mean. But the one in The Yellow Wallpaper and the one in Story of an Hour, they were actually tender, loving husbands who happened to, the only reason why they controlled their wives is that was the societal expectations of the time, that the wife is considered property of the husband. And so that's why the husband behaves that way, but he does it out of love. So you cannot see the husband as the villain. So her desire for self-determination, but his death has made her see something she hasn't seen before and might not likely never have seen if he had lived. Her desire for self-determination. In other words, she wants the ability to make her own decisions. Even though she loves her husband and she loves, everything about him, she still wants to have her own, occasionally make her own decisions because she's a grown adult. Once she allows herself to recognize her approaching freedom, she utters the word free over and over again, relishing it. Her fear and her uncomprehending stare are replaced by acceptance and excitement. She looks forward to years to come that would belong to her absolutely. In the medieval ages, the only time a woman was truly free to do whatever she wanted, this is not the Middle Ages, this story did not take place in the Middle Ages, but I'm just saying that ever since the Middle Ages, the only time a woman felt free is after her husband died. Because when the woman is young, the parents would choose, the husband for her, and then while the husband is alive, she has to obey her husband. And when the woman is a child, she has to obey her father. And so before the son becomes adult, if the husband dies young, in between that time, when she's still raising the kid and the husband has died and she's still young enough, then that's the time when the woman in medieval ages up to the early 20th century, that was the time when the woman could feel free. And so this is the kind of freedom that Louise is envisioning for her as she gradually grapples with the news that her husband has just died. So she spends this story sitting in her room, looking out a window, relishing the idea that now that her husband has died, she's getting more and more excited that she's free to do what she wants. And she's becoming very, very excited about the freedom. She could live for herself. In one of the most important passages for the story, Chopin describes Louise's vision of self-determination. It's not so much about getting rid of her husband as it is about being entirely in charge of her own life, body and soul. In other words, being able to self-determine when you get up in the morning, when you cook, when you go out, no curfews, that sort of thing, and more. To me, it's similar to when a kid first goes to college and realizes, oh wow, there's no parents there to give you curfew. You can stay out as late as you want, or you can study as much as you self-discipline yourself to. In other words, there's a kind of freedom and self-determination that every adult takes for granted. So there would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a will upon a fellow creature. Now the phrase men and women, Louise never catalogs any specific offenses Brentley has committed against her. Rather, the implication seems to be that marriage can be stifling for both parties. So Brentley, the husband, is not the bad guy, as I said. It's society. It's society obligations. It's society that obligates the wife to be the property of the husband. It obligates the husband to control his wife. And you can have a loving marriage still, but you can still treat your wife like she's a small child. When Brentley, the irony of joy that kills. Oh, that statement just says a lot, okay? So then you find out in an ironic twist that Brentley Mallard did not die. He actually was injured, but he was not killed in the accident. So when Brentley Mallard enters the house alive and well in the final scene, his appearance is utterly ordinary. He is a little travel stain, composed, carrying his gripsack and umbrella. His mundane appearance contrasts greatly with Louise's feverish triumph and her walking down the stairs like a goddess of victory. In other words, Louise walks down the stairs. She's convinced herself that she's now free of her husband. She could do whatever she wants. Then she sees her husband alive, and then the shock of seeing him alive, and then she's like, she dies of heart attack. The shock of seeing him alive, and her freedom suddenly taken away from her, and then she just couldn't take it anymore, and so she dies of a heart attack. So the irony of joy of seeing her husband, that kills, because she dies of a heart. She already had a weak heart to begin with, so the shock of finding him alive and having her freedom taken away kills her. So when the doctors determine that Louise died of heart attack, of a joy that kills, the reader immediately recognizes the irony. It seems clear that her shock was not joy over her husband's survival, but rather distress over losing her cherished newfound freedom. Louise did briefly experience joy, the joy of imagining herself in control of her own life, and it was the removal of that intense joy that led to her death. So that meant that when she saw her husband represented prison. It represented being under his control. It represented, in other words, the husband represented no more freedom. And so then she dies. And then even her death is symbolic, because her death symbolizes that the only way she could be free of her husband and experience complete freedom and self-determination is through her death. And in many stories about women, this time in history, the women end up either committing suicide. I remember reading one story where a woman walks into the ocean after the whole story was about how she and her husband, similar to this one, where the husband is controlling, and then in the end, I can't remember the name of the story, but it's similar in the theme. I'm going to look it up. And she walks into the ocean, and that's it. So that the author, insinuates that the only way that women could be truly free of their husband was through death. And so that's sort of like what happens here in the story of An Hour, where the only way Mrs. Mallard can be totally free is to die. So this is actually a very common theme in stories of this time period. So, and we've already read another. We're going to read The Yellow Wallpaper, and then in week 7, you're going to read a similar story where a woman tries to escape from her domineering husband. So that is a common theme, because in the early 20th century, women had no rights. So I hope you enjoyed this analysis of the story of An Hour. Louise can see patches of sky. So this became symbolic of her freedom, this patches of sky. And then it's foreshadowing. When the author, when Susan Chopin kept talking about open sky. That means that's foreshadowing that Mrs. Mallard's death, in which her spirit will go to heaven by the end of the story. So that is the foreshadowing of the freedom she would feel. So this is a very rich story with many layers of interpretation. That's a classic, and it's in every anthology, Norton Anthology, all the different anthologies of American literature. It's a classic. And every time I teach American literature, I teach the story of an hour. It's a great piece, so if you want to do your analysis for your discussion forum on this story, be my guest. So this ends my video on the analysis of The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me.